Welcome to the FTN Thrive podcast. We interview leaders in the functional health space who bring you the most up-to-date, cutting-edge information for people who have tried it all for their health issues. We hope you enjoy the show.
And they are cumulative. So a lot of people think, oh, it was at this moment I had a car accident, all of a sudden then I was fatigued. When actually it had been all the toxicities and all the stressors had been building up in your body until that moment, and that was the straw that broke the camel's back.
Well, hello, my friends, and welcome back to another episode of the FDN Thrive podcast. My name is Evan Transu, aka Health Coach Ev, and I will be your host for today's show. Now, we're going to be interviewing Dr. Evan Hirsch, and he is the first non-functional diagnostic nutrition practitioner on the show, but that's okay. We are really interested in highlighting any leader in the functional space, and that sometimes includes people that have not gone through the FDN program. Now, do I think they should? Of course, but that doesn't mean they don't have amazing things to offer outside of the things that we already talk about here. So Dr. Evan, how conveniently named, by the way, you want to talk about a confusing podcast, Evan and Evan going back and forth the whole time. 1 month into his family medicine residency training program, he met his amazing wife, Stacy. She was full of life, social with friends, a great cook, traveler, small business owner, and committed to growth through self-examination. 4 months later, though, she was diagnosed with chronic fatigue, and he had no tools to help her. She had adrenal fatigue, her cortisol levels were non-existent, and she was told to rest up, and she would be better within 1 to 2 years. Well, she purchased a sauna, took adrenal supplements, and did coffee enemas, and worked on her psycho-spiritual side, and she was mostly better in 3 years. Dr. Evan felt powerless and began his path learning everything he could about fatigue. After he graduated residency in 2007, he started his own practice. He realized that his energy wasn't like it was prior to residency. He was able to function, but he was tired. He didn't have much energy for exercise, nor did he prioritize it. He had worked long and hard for his opportunity to create the kind of integrative medical practice that he wanted, so he pushed ahead. He thought it was a post-residency issue that would resolve on its own in a few months. Well, unfortunately, Dr. Evan found that that was not the case, but fortunately, it was a mix of what his wife dealt with in combination with what he dealt with that led to a super passionate practitioner and doctor that is here today to deliver some awesome information. I will not spoil it, so you know what I'm going to say. Without further ado, let's get to the interview with Dr. Evan. Dr. Evan, thanks so much for being here today, man. We appreciate it.
Evan, thanks so much for having me on.
I think this is really fun. You know, I've always wanted to be a doctor, but oh my goodness, I just couldn't pay enough attention in school. So I had to study this stuff myself and get some certification. So I love that we got Evan and Dr. Evan on. This is going to be really fun.
Right.
Now, one of the things I always love to start off the interviews with on this podcast is really figuring out where our doctors or practitioners started out from, because, you know, you're an MD, and very rarely do we see someone getting into more of what we could call the natural or functional space by accident. So I'm curious, like, give us a little bit about your background and maybe even any health issues you've dealt with yourself.
Sure, Evan. So for me, it was really a matter of being curious. I grew up with a mom who tried to fix her own cholesterol with oat bran muffins. We actually had oat bran muffins, oat bran cereal, oat bran everything for about 6 months, and she dropped her cholesterol from 300 to 250. So that was definitely a success, and that was early on. It kind of showed me some more of the possibilities from nature. But I grew up in New Jersey, never met a naturopath, never met a chiropractor, and so I was good at science. I liked working with people. It was like, all right, well, I'm gonna go and I'm gonna be a doctor. I'm gonna be an MD. Barely even heard of DOs at that time. I'm not that old. I mean, we're talking about this was like the 90s, but still, I just didn't have that experience. Now, if I had that sort of exposure, it might have been a little bit different in the path that I went, but this path worked out for me. So I went off to undergrad and then to medical school. And then when I went into residency, like I said, I was very curious, had a lot of questions, and didn't get the answers that I wanted from the allopathic doctors that I was training under. And so I started looking at other things. I had a pathologist mentor who actually exposed me initially to Native American healing. And then I looked at hypnotherapy, and actually, my first training was in hypnotherapy, which I no longer do. But that exposed me to somebody from the American Holistic Medical Association, and they had said, "Hey, come along, and you can learn from us." And I started that pathway. So I learned holistic medicine. I was board certified in holistic medicine before I graduated residency. I was trained in medical acupuncture, which I was performing on exam tables during my residency. I was yoga teacher trained. So all of these things I got trained along the way, and then came out of residency and kind of started a integrative and then a functional medicine practice. Now, also what happened during residency was that I met my wife a month in, and 3 months into our relationship, all of a sudden she couldn't get out of bed anymore. She was really fatigued. And so that kind of set me on this path of fatigue. That was my first real introduction. And then because I was asking, well, let's just say I felt incredibly powerless at this time. Here's this woman that I fell in love with, and now she's sick, and I'm supposed to be at the top of my game in residency as a family practice resident, and I'm just not able to help her with what I know and what I'm able to garner from some of these other practitioners who I'm working with and my attendings and older docs. And so I went on this journey of trying to help her. Now I didn't get very far because I was working 80-hour work weeks, but then in 2006 we got married, had a child, got um, started my own practice, and then a couple years later I actually got fatigue, and my fatigue lasted for 5 years, and it just about destroyed my life, just about destroyed my relationship with my wife. Here she is coming out of her own fatigue, which lasted 3 years. I can't help out at home. I can't help out with our new daughter. I can barely keep my eyes open at work. I had to keep hiring people to do my jobs. It's an incredibly stressful time for me. And I finally realized, because I was not a good patient, I finally realized that I had to find the cause. And what I realized was that there were 10 causes of fatigue, and that I had to go after every single one of them in order to have complete resolution and the energy that I have today.
Okay, wow. Few points there. One, I will say that there is hardly anything more motivating, and some of the best practitioners I've seen in this space have not. It hasn't just been motivated by their own health issues, but it's been motivated by the health issues of people that they really loved and cared about. Like, it's one thing when we deal with it, I think that motivates us a lot. But when someone you care about's dealing with it, it's like, especially you already taking a doctor path, it's like, all right, I'm supposed to be able to figure this out. I got to do that. Number two, I love what you said about New Jersey, because you're going through this in the 90s. I'm born in the 90s, and I'm in Pennsylvania. I live 5 minutes away from New Jersey, and I will say that this area, even still for me, when I was an 18-year-old guy, was very tough to find the resources that I need. And not to go too off track, but you know how we were talking about, we have this mutual connection of Reed Davis, the founder of FDN. The whole reason I even know Reed and the FDN team is because I went out to California. I literally drove out there with my best friend because I knew that's where all the natural people were. That's at least what I thought, right? We have that stereotype over here, like, oh, a bunch of hippies out there. And of course, I wouldn't call any of the work that we do or that you do hippies stuff. It's pretty scientific, actually. But that was my vision of this. I knew I needed something natural because it was kind of working for me, but I exhausted the 2 naturopaths that are in my entire county of 800,000 people, and I didn't get results. So I had to go somewhere else. So just to be clear, before we kind of dive into the different causes of fatigue, when the average person hears fatigue that might not have dealt with some kind of like chronic stuff, they might just think, okay, well, maybe I had a really long work week, or I was under a lot of stress, or maybe I was fighting with a family member and I just, sleep in on the weekend and I feel better. Can you explain the difference between normal fatigue and the type of fatigue that you're getting or that you're talking about, which goes on for years for some people?
Absolutely. So, the fatigue that I'm talking about that really needs to be addressed is a tiredness that's not relieved with rest. So, if you're getting 7 to 9 hours a night and you're still tired during the day and you're surviving on caffeine, there's a problem. Now, sometimes if you're 18 years old or 20 years old and you're in college and you're burning the candle at both ends during finals week, and then you come home and you're crashed out for 2 weeks and your parents don't see you because you're sleeping all that time, and then you pop out, takes you a couple more days to get normal, and then you're fine, that's different. because you've kind of gotten back to normal. But if you're finding that you're sleeping a tremendous amount, or if you're sleeping even just 7 to 9 hours a night and you're still tired during the day, your body is yelling at you that there is a problem and you need to pay attention. Otherwise, you're going to have other problems. A lot of the diseases of longevity that we see, whether it's heart attack, heart disease, stroke, Alzheimer's, cancer, all have the same causes as fatigue. As we're going to get into it, a lot of the toxicities that we see in the environment that gets into our bodies end up causing these diseases of longevity. So, as soon as you notice that you're having fatigue, you have to address it so that your life doesn't suffer and then you don't have any of these issues as you get older.
Okay, thank you. I think that's very useful for the people out there because it's a shame to me, and this happens with a lot of chronic diseases, let's be honest, but there's like a stigma around this, oh, you're just being lazy, or hey, you slept so much last night, why can't you get up and do it? And it was especially tough for myself. That's why I was so excited to interview you today. I've dealt with a version of this, not for 5, 6 years, but I mean, certainly for a good period of time. And it was just like, what am I doing wrong? Like, why is this happening to me? Why am I a early 20s male who can't even like work a normal job because what you described, those
Mhm.
eyes just feeling like they're closing in the middle of the day. I mean, it's debilitating. So I'd love to jump into the different causes that you discovered with this. So I mean, let's jump right into it. I'm not sure if you want to talk about all 10 today, but I'm open to hearing like maybe the most prevalent causes. Tell us more about those.
Yeah, we'll be able to talk about all 10. It won't take too long.
Great.
So, the causes can really be broken up into two categories: deficiencies and toxicities. Deficiencies are those things that are not in the body that are supposed to be, and toxicities are things that are in the body that aren't supposed to be there. So, when we take a look at deficiencies, we're talking about deficiencies in hormones like adrenal hormones, thyroid hormones, sex hormones, deficiencies in vitamins like vitamin B12 and vitamin D, deficiencies in minerals like magnesium and iron, deficiencies in mitochondrial function, which is in the energy center of every cell in the body except for red blood cells, and it makes about 70 to 80% of our energy. And then deficiencies in lifestyle habits that I know you guys work a lot with, not enough sleep, not enough water, not enough good food, not enough movement. So those are the deficiencies. And then when we look at the toxicities, we're looking at things like heavy metal toxicity. More than 100,000 pounds of mercury are being dumped into our oceans every single year that we are then absorbing. Greater than 70% of all lipsticks have lead in them, and the list goes on and on. We're looking at chemical toxicity. 84,000 different chemicals we're exposed to on a regular basis, from pesticides to plastics, that negatively affect our physiology. Then we're looking at mold toxicity. So, about half of the buildings in first world countries have water damage, and most of those have mold. Mold is a huge problem in fatigue, and a lot of people don't realize that they have it, which is why it's such an important part of our program. And then infections. A couple years ago, the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta changed their tune around the number of new cases of Lyme that they were seeing every year. They went from 30,000 to, oh, actually, it's probably more like 300,000. And when we
Oops, yeah, it's
say
only
Lyme,
10 times the amount.
right. And so when we're talking about Lyme disease, it's not just Borrelia or AKA Lyme, it's also a number of these other co-infections that we're seeing more of. Bartonella, Babesia, Anaplasma, Epstein-Barr virus. And then of course there's a lot of these that are in the gut, like yeast infections and parasitic infections, and bacterial infections. So that's the infectious component. So that's heavy metals, chemicals, molds, infections, and then allergies, whether it's food allergies or inhaled allergies, that will cause inflammation in the body, which can cause fatigue. And then there's negative emotional patterns. So, these come oftentimes from something called ACEs, or adverse childhood events, which recently changed its definition to anything less than nurturing. So, this is anything that happened to you growing up that was less than nurturing. So, for some people, this is more like divorce or alcoholic living at home, physical, sexual, emotional abuse. But for others, it can be like me, it was rejection of a peer group, that changed the way that I looked at the world, increased stress on me mentally and emotionally. So that is negative emotional patterns. And then the last one is electromagnetic frequencies. So anything that has a battery that releases rays, whether they're magnetic or radiation, that are damaging our mitochondria as well as our DNA, are going to have negative effects on our physiology and cause fatigue. So there's your list of 10.
Okay, that was pretty impressive. Yeah, you just rattled those right off. And I'm loving doing these because I feel like I'm learning a ton too. I should be paying these guys to do this, you know? So I appreciate you dropping some knowledge there. I'm not going to ask for a whole lecture on every single point, but I think there's a few things that are really worth touching on, because there's things in there that people might either not have heard of or there's tons of misunderstandings about. So I will go actually with your last one first, talking about non-native EMFs, right? Can you explain, I mean, to the best of your ability that we're able to break this down, because I understand that it's kind of complex, how exactly does that affect our health in today's world? Because I always look at this and I'm trying to think, there is just almost no way we can mimic what our ancestors did unless we are like out camping on one of the major hiking trails of the United States or maybe somewhere in the world, like the Appalachian Trail. And I feel like we all feel the difference out there. But outside of that, I mean, it's unavoidable. I got two computer screens around me right now. I got the phone. I got this high tech microphone to make it sound better. You know, this is having an effect on me, but it's almost like we have to live with it. So, how bad really is this, and what's happening to the body when my body is exposed to these EMFs?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, there's a couple different ways of looking at this. One is that yes, it's damaging the body, it's damaging the mitochondria, which is supposed to be making 70 to 80% of our energy. Consequently, if you're damaging it, if you're damaging the DNA, if you're causing inflammation in the body, that is going to be draining a lot of the components that would end up encouraging your energy or increasing your energy. But what's also important to remember is that everybody who has fatigue has multiple causes of fatigue, and they are cumulative. So a lot of people think, oh, it was at this moment I had a car accident, all of a sudden then I was fatigued. When actually it had been your all the toxicities and all the stressors had been building up in your body until that moment, and that was the straw that broke the camel's back. The reason why I bring this up is because there are definitely things we can do to decrease EMFs and them coming into our body and into our lives, but people who react to them, they generally are more toxic. So they have more of those toxicity causes that I had mentioned, and that as you remove those, you are going to feel better and better, and you're going to be less reactive to the electromagnetic frequencies. Now, but to answer your question about what you can do, there are a number of different things. Like, you can measure what is the amount of dirty electricity that's coming into a room, and then you can plug in some capacitors to decrease that. You can attach things now to your phone and to your computer to decrease the amount of EMFs that are being put out by those. You can hardwire your computer in your home so that it's going via Ethernet to your router and you don't have Wi-Fi on. So those are a number of things. But yes, you're absolutely right. They're ubiquitous. It's really hard to avoid right now. You do what you can, but then you also try to decrease your exposures and then the amount of toxicities that you have present.
Okay, awesome. And I think that's a great thing for the average person and even myself, because, you know, you really can get pretty complex with the understanding of the EMFs and then how they actually impact the body. So I appreciate that explanation. I noticed several years back, I had to live in, I say had, like it was such a punishment, but I got to live in Miami for a month coming from Pennsylvania in the month of October. So, you know, from being in New Jersey, that's a great time to go, right? It's right when this area is like starting to get not so fun temperature wise and it's like back to 80 and sunny. And listen, I know Florida homes have a lot of water damage and mold can usually be an issue down there. So I'll never know if it was that or something else. But I started feeling like crud again. I was breaking out. I wasn't happy. And I was, you know, basically at a work opportunity. Like I should have felt good, but I was working right on Biscayne Boulevard. Like, you know, I think that's the uh, city owns that tower or whatever. And it's, you know, headquarters of Miami, EMF everywhere. And that was really the only thing I could correlate it with because when I come home or when I came home then, you know, I'm living with my parents and it's not that they have no EMFs, but you know, they live on a few acres. they're kind of 15 minutes from town. It's really only their house 700 feet back from the road. You only pick up one router and that's their own when you look at the Wi-Fi list, as opposed to,
Hmm.
a townhouse when you can get 25 different Wi-Fi signals now, if
Right.
not more. So I concluded, I do think that it was having more of an effect on my body at that time than I realized, because Miami is just such a toxic city for that type of thing. But let's say maybe it was some mold in the home and I didn't know about it. That was going to be my second question anyway here, because I think that's one of the other points you made, where there is so much confusion around that, but it's becoming such a hot topic. Like, why, first of all, why is mold in everything? Like in 50% of these first world homes, I mean, people argue like, my home's clean, I don't have mold in it. So like, how does it actually get into a clean home, quote unquote? And then what does that mean for the body? Because weren't humans exposed to mold spores and allergens for like pretty much the entire time we've been around? Like, what's the difference between now and then?
Yeah, the difference is outdoor mold versus indoor mold. And so the mold is growing on the particle board in the drywall, and that becomes fodder for the mold. And you get different strains that end up producing different mycotoxins that are not native to what we should experiencing, or what we were experiencing when we were in teepees. And so what ends up happening is that, you can have a pipe burst, you can have a leak in the roof, you can have a flood in the basement, and you just need something to get wet and then stay wet. So, oftentimes people will, and nobody ever thinks that they have mold exposure. Usually, the first time you ask them about it, the first time they've heard about it, no, there's no, mold. Haven't seen any mold on the wall. That's the other thing too, is that if you see mold, it's the tip of the iceberg. It means you've got two-thirds underneath that appearance that has mold. So a lot of times you don't even see the mold, and people have mold in their homes. Excuse me. And so, that's really important to pay attention to. But those are some of the issues. But yeah, that's what I was saying, is that oftentimes people don't even think that they've had mold exposure. And so I'll ask them once and they'll say no, and then I'll kind of list off some of the things, and then they'll come back later, or they'll message me afterwards and say, you know what, every single winter our basement flooded, and it always had a weird smell. So that's all it takes. Or it doesn't even have to be, or a flood once, and then it just doesn't dry, because the humidity in places like Florida and the Pacific Northwest and lots of other parts of the country, if it stays above 50%, that's when mold grows. So
Oh,
it's a
wow.
very easy recipe.
Okay, got it. I didn't know that. And this just happened to a family member of mine recently. Now, thankfully, none of them are chronically ill. They're healthy people, but they had an attachment on, or an addition, I guess you would call it, on the house that was only put on in the last like 15 years. Beautiful home, right? Nothing,
Mhm.
you don't go into this. It's not like unclean. It's a beautiful home. And when they were ripping up the walls to like redo something in the addition, Dr. Evan, they found mold everywhere. And that is like where our family goes and hangs out. It's where all the kids
Mhm.
play. I mean, it's serious stuff. And I love what you said about, if you see it, it's the tip of the iceberg. I was kind of taught by a mentor of mine. He's like, if you are seeing the mold, you have like a real problem going on, because that's
Right.
not good.
Well, and what's interesting too is that, when people say, "Well, I have a new home, or I have a new addition, or whatever," and I say, "Okay, so when you're driving around town and you see new construction and it's raining, what does it look like? Is it getting wet?" Yes,
Exactly.
absolutely, it's getting wet. And then what happens the first sunny day? All the contractors come out and they seal that thing up nice and warm. So now it's wet and it's warm, right?
Wow.
And with the newer homes, they're even tighter, and you really want some good airflow in order to decrease the amount of mold that's in a bot that's in a home as well. And oftentimes you're not getting that with the newer construction.
Sure. It is unbelievable to me how many of our seemingly modern conveniences, as we call them, end up being troublesome in a lot of ways. It's to the point where I've talked to friends and family members. They're like, "Oh, what is just everything bad in today's world?" And I'm like, "No," because they just don't want to think everything's a problem or whatever. And I get it; it can be overwhelming. But my point is, I have this philosophy now where I'm like, you know what? If this is not something our ancestors, like our real ancestors, would have done, there is at least some chance that it is subject to harming us. And something as beneficial
Absolutely.
as a home, you would think, great shelter, awesome thing. well, we didn't have drywall and we didn't have this stuff where we're doing construction in the rain and then, like you said, sealing it up the next day in warm weather. That's not natural. You maybe
Right.
had like some sticks or hid in a cave or whatever we did, TP, and we just wouldn't have had the same problem. So it's amazing because we have all this good and yet it can cause so many issues. Now, the last one I really wanted to focus on of the 10 points that you listed is the first one that you said, and that was more about the deficiencies. So I am so curious because it's something that actually oftentimes even confuses me to this day. And I think it absolutely confuses the average person. How is it that we have, and I want to speak obviously not for everyone, but for more people than ever before, we have access to tons of food, we have access to all the supplements in the world, and yet we are seeing huge nutrient deficiencies, certainly ones that had to be bigger than ones that our ancestors had. Why is everyone deficient if we have access to so much food and so many supplements?
So there's a couple of things. That's a great question too, there's a couple of reasons. And so the first reason is going to be the quality of the food. And so the more organic the food gets, the more it's going to be in a natural form, taking the correct nutrients from the ground. But a lot of even with the organic products, I mean, they're better, but a lot of the ground is being stripped. And if you're not rotating crops appropriately, giving rest, whatever, then you're not going to be rejuvenating the soil with the vitamins and minerals and phytonutrients that it needs, that it will then convey into the fruit. So that's one of the things. The other thing is that the more stress you have, the more deficiencies you're going to have. And so whether that's mental, emotional, or physical stressors, that's the case. And by physical stressors, I'm talking about things like the toxicities that I mentioned, the heavy metals, the chemicals, the molds, the infections, the allergies, the negative emotional patterns are more mental emotional. But those are all the physical stressors. And, when I talked about these 10 causes, the deficiencies are actually caused by the toxicities. So sometimes there's some genetic SNPs, genetic variations that are causing some of these deficiencies. But really, it's all about these stressors, these mental, emotional, and physical stressors that we're in contact with that are making it hard to thrive as human organisms.
Okay, got it. And that's actually pretty insightful because the main one that I had always went to was just like I only had one piece of that puzzle and it was like, all right, well it makes sense that the extra stress that we're under, our body needs more nutrients, so that leads to deficiencies. I get that, but I mean there's so many factors in this. So, all right, well, without honing in on all 10 points that you mentioned, I'm curious because as someone listening to this, I am more than convinced Dr. Evan knows the stuff about fatigue. I mean, you rattled off those 10 like it was nothing. Okay, but I'm overwhelmed now because you just listed so many different things. I'm like, how the heck do I ever address all that? But I know that's probably what your program and work is for. So, from the best way that you can explain it, like in a simple way, what is it that you do and how do you possibly address all 10 of those very different factors for the patients that come to you?
Right. And how do we do it when everybody has a different 10 factors? Because when somebody has fatigue, they're going to have 8 to 10 of those. And they're going to be a different 8 to 10 than, from Joe Schmo to Sally Sue. So it's very important that we get specific about which causes they have. And so that's really the take home message of this talk. And that's step one of my 4-step process is finding the causes. And when we look at these causes that we talked about, the deficiencies and the toxicities, people might think that they have to get a lot of labs done, but in reality, 75% of these causes can be determined by symptoms alone. So people join our program, they print out the workbook, and immediately they start going through it and they fill out just based off of their symptoms. About an hour or two later, they're going to be able to determine 75% of their causes, and then they also know which labs to do. And then our program takes them through the process. Okay, if this is the cause that you have, and then we know that this is then the solution to that cause. This is how we fix that cause so that you're only taking the fixes for the causes that you have. And as we go through, so then that first step, if I can jump into our my 4-step process, that first step is
Yeah,
finding the
please do.
causes. Cool. And then the second step is replacing the deficiencies that we talked about. Third step is opening up the detoxification pathways, making sure bowel is moving right, liver, kidney, lymph, neural lymph, which is in the brain. And then, so we can jump into step four, which is removing toxicities. Now, this process is all about step four, removing the toxicities. However, step two and three have to happen first in order to be successful at removing the toxicities in step four.
Oh, I love that so much because that is something that I've seen actually. Well, certainly not everywhere, but it's starting to shift like industry wide where people are realizing, we got to build the person back up a little bit first before we start attacking pathogens. Or even for
Right.
you, step three is opening up those detox pathways, right? Like you don't necessarily want to do that as step one on someone who's really chronically ill and suffering. So I also like that you said that you're finding that you can use this workbook to figure out what's going on with people based on symptoms. Just out of sheer curiosity, I want to know, are there other main things that you're finding come up more often than you'd expect for people that are chronically fatigued? Like, do they also deal with a lot of headaches or a lot of stomach issues? Like, are there some symptoms that are coming up more often than not?
So it really depends on the different causes that they have. Oftentimes, if they have mold, they'll have sinus conditions and they'll have skin rashes and they'll have itchy skin, itchy anus, itchy ears. If they have some of the chronic stealth infections like Lyme, we're looking at symptoms that come and go, symptoms that move around the body, like muscle pain, joint pain, or nerve pain that's moving, from one joint to a couple days or a couple weeks or a couple months later to another joint. There's pain with Borrelia. There's pain on the bottom of the, or sorry, Bartonella. There's pain on the bottom of the feet and muscle cramps that are happening at night, sleep problems, thyroid issues. With something like Babesia, we're looking at people who are hot all the time. They've got spontaneous sweating, night sweats. They've got awful sleep, depression to the point of suicidal thoughts, anxiety to the point of panic attacks, and usually some shortness of breath. And you don't have to have all of those different symptoms, but having a few of them, the few of the conglomeration of symptoms can really point to which of these infections we see. Now, I would say, most of the time we're seeing people who've got chronic fatigue, they like I said, they've got 8 to 10 of these different causes, but the big ones really are what I call the big three, which is adrenals, thyroid, and mitochondria. And then they'll usually also have mold and an infection, if not two infections.
Okay. I love that you talk about mitochondria, by the way. It's something that only, came across to me in literature that I was reading in the last couple of years. And I'm like, wow, I'm sure you know what I mean when I say, as we get more into the future, this is going to be a bigger and bigger part of healthcare. And it's very promising research. I'm very excited about it. So when people are coming to you, can they come to you online? Like, what is the best way that they can find you? Do you have a normal practice now in person? Like, I know that you're still a traditional MD. Like, how does that work?
I am an MD in name only now. So my whole business is online as a coach. And I do that so that I can help people across state lines, across national lines. About a third of all my clientele now is internationally in the EU and beyond. We have stores now for supplements and labs in the States, in the EU, in the UK, and in New Zealand in order to help all the people internationally. But yeah, I don't use my MD anymore. I'm not prescribing. I'm not ordering labs. I'm educating, right, making recommendations, as you know, as an FDN. I'm operating as a coach in order to help all these people. But I obviously bring my all of my knowledge with me that I acquired as an MD.
That's amazing. And I say this all the time on this podcast and in my personal life, and I make it very clear to people I'm not kidding. Like, we are never against Western medicine. I like to utilize the best of both worlds, right? Not personally, like I'll send someone to a doctor I trust or whatever. But folks, you really got to think about this. This is an individual who suffered with fatigue himself and whose wife suffered with fatigue herself, went through the schooling, and now you choose just to use basically those letters and you rather serve people as a coach, even though you have the option to do either. That is a very interesting thing. Don't take it from me, take it from the guy who's actually a doctor. That's pretty fascinating stuff to me. I have a few more questions for you, real quick. One, what is something that you do still apply from your medical training? Is it just what you know about the body because of everything that you learned? Like, of course, there's good from both worlds. So I'd like to know, like, yeah, what is one of the number one things that you learned from your medical training that maybe you still do use, if in no other way other than just having the knowledge in the back of your head? Maybe you can't literally use it, but I'm curious about that.
That's a good question. I think that a big part of it were the thousands of people that I had seen that really got me good at my craft. I think one thing in particular is understanding thyroid better than I've seen some other practitioners where, I did a lot of testing, subjective testing around thyroid. And I found that having a subjective ramp up for folks on thyroid, they have low thyroid symptoms, but they did not have, quote unquote, abnormal labs. And so, but they still needed some additional thyroid support. And what I found was that by supporting the adrenals and then the mitochondria, which make the thyroid work better, and then going into the thyroid and doing a subjective thyroid ramp up, I found I found incredible success with that process. And I know that if I hadn't had my medical background with my knowledge around thyroid, the thyroid medications, because I was very familiar with using, T4 and T3 separately as prescriptions, as well as armor, and then the glandulars. I just had a breadth of exposure, which people don't have. There's some people who say, well, T4 doesn't do anything, the prescription levothyroxine or Synthroid, and that's all about T3, and that's really what you want. Well, that's just not true. They have different functions, and what I found was that I could ramp up somebody on T3, and they would still have some low thyroid symptoms. Oftentimes, it's hair loss is really the big one, as well as weight gain, that are really affected by T4. And I would give them T4, and then that would take care of those. And so it's this, but it really depends on the person. That was the other thing that I learned, is that, not being wed to the tool that I have, but realizing that, giving somebody the support that they need as an individual.
Very cool. I feel like, honestly, man, people like you are the future, and they're still pretty rare. It's the people that do have the knowledge from the best of both worlds and can just serve people at such an amazing level because of that. So, my second to last question, then naturally, is where can people find you if they're like, all right, Dr. Evans, the man, clearly knows his stuff, and I certainly deal with fatigue. I want to get in contact with him. How can they do that?
So they can find me at fixyourfatigue.com. So that's FIXYOURFATIGUE.com. I've got lots of free stuff on there to get educated, podcast, masterclass, mini course. And then if you're interested in working with us and you want to have a conversation, you can jump on a free call with us and we can see if we're a good fit.
Awesome. So and of course, guys, that'll all be in the show notes as well, so you can find that. But Fix Your Fatigue, very catchy name. I think we'll all remember that. That's for sure. My final question is like the one I usually consider the most fun. It is the signature question on the FDN Thrive podcast. And I know as functional practitioners, we do not really recommend anything universally except like getting good sleep and maybe getting sunlight, things like that. But I am curious, if Dr. Evan had a magic wand and you could change one health habit of every single person in this world, whether it was getting them to do something or getting everyone not to do something, what is that one thing that you would change?
Oh, that's such a good question, and so many different ways to go. I'm kind of arm wrestling between having everybody go gluten free and having everybody go sugar free. So it's interesting, I've talked quite a bit about supplements and toxicities and all these other things, but when it all comes down to it, so much, like, it's really hard to get better if you're not doing a good job with your diet.
So, all right, let's see it though. If you could only pick one, I'm telling you right now, I'm like, Dr. Evan, listen, I'm new to this. I'm only giving up gluten or I'm only giving up sugar. You're crazy if you think I'm giving up both. Which one are you making me do?
I guess it depends on how much sugar and gluten they're eating, but
Fair enough. All right, we could leave it at that. It's really interesting though, because you are we're a new-ish podcast and certainly not the first one to say gluten-free. And we didn't even talk about that today. Most of the other people had mentioned that a few times. So it's very interesting, all these different things that we're hearing, folks, and people are still going back to this gluten thing. I guess, I wasn't expecting this, but I would like to ask, and you can go as in depth as you'd like. If maybe that's just a little summary, that's fine. Why would someone who is clearly focusing as a niche towards fatigue be so concerned with people removing gluten? I'm curious.
Well, gluten is like eating a sock. Gluten
I've heard a
is
lot of things about gluten, but that's the first time I've heard that one.
That's the way that I like to describe it to people because it's foreign. The body sees it as completely foreign. Like we've been around in this form for the last few million years as humans, and gluten's been around for 10,000. But when we first met it, it was 7 chromosome organism, and now it's like a 49 chromosome organism. So it's incredibly foreign to who we are. And so what it does, anything that is foreign in the body, it's the immune system's job to get rid of it. And so when it sees gluten, it's going to react to it. And guess what happens when it reacts to it? You get inflammation. And inflammation causes pain and dysfunction and damage to the intestinal lining and everything else. And then of course there's components to wheat and to gluten, like if it's got pesticides on it and glyphosate and all this other stuff that's causing other problems too. So that is the reason why it is so harmful.
Well, folks, if you haven't cut out gluten by now, or you're even listening to the FDN Thrive podcast, how many practitioners of all shapes, sizes, and backgrounds do you need to hear from to know that this stuff is no good? I removed it several years ago as a guy in my early 20s. It was certainly not cool to do it then, but it is pretty cool now because my health is awesome. Of course, I've done many other things as well, but that was a barrier that could not have been overcome by just doing everything else right. It had to leave my diet, that is for sure. Well, I want to thank you guys so much for tuning in to another episode of the FDN Thrive podcast. As always, I'm your host, Evan Transu, aka Health Coach Ev, and we've been talking to Dr. Evan Hirsch today of FixYourFatigue.com. Please go check him out as well. The only thing I ask at the end of this podcast is that you would be so kind as to leave us a 5-star rating on whatever podcast platform you are listening on, iTunes podcast, or I think it's called Apple Podcast now. Regardless, would be awesome to leave a review there. This is information that not everyone has, guys. I sometimes forget this myself, but I try to remember it as much as I can. We are in a blessed bubble. And we are lucky to have this network and be hearing from people who are so advanced in functional medicine. I would say, without exaggeration, it's got to be 95% plus of the world, maybe a lot more, has no idea that this stuff exists, and they are out there struggling with their health. It is affecting their lives, their passions, their family. Like, I think about this stuff, and I hope you do too. And that's why we got to spread this information. So whether it's you just sharing it verbally, that's cool with me, as long as it's accurate, or resharing the information on here, please make sure you're letting people know that this stuff exists. It is so, so important. Well, I'm looking forward to the next interview, and I will talk to you guys soon. Thanks again. Thanks for tuning in to the FDN Thrive podcast. If you feel like you've been stuck in the cycle of trial and error when it comes to your health issues, our team can help. Whether you've tried every different diet out there without lasting success, spent way too much money on supplements at your local health food store, or been told that your lab tests are normal despite feeling anything but normal, we have your back. Go to fdnthrive.com and click the Get Started Here button if you're ready to stop playing guessing games with your health. That's fdnthrive.com.